When a person asks themselves, how can I become happy? They have usually already taken a wrong turn somewhere, or were led astray from the very beginning, because the question itself contains a trap. Become implies an admission that you are not happy yet, and that is already a mindset that controls attention and therefore the content of your thoughts, and as a result, your inner state. The harder you chase happiness, the further it retreats, turning into a mirage pursued by an irritated mind, a tired body, and an increasingly dissatisfied soul. Happiness does not come as a reward for effort. It is not granted for achievements, not bestowed by circumstances, not purchased through experience. Happiness is not a summit to be climbed. It is the ground on which everything else becomes possible. To find it, you do not need to search. You need to stop and see where this feeling grows from. Sufficiency is enough. Self-sufficiency is enough. And this is where things get truly interesting. An inner journey in which we encounter not answers, but ourselves. Let us imagine that someone seriously asks, how does one become happy? To avoid drowning in philosophical reflections on the nature of happiness, let us take a simple and functional definition as our foundation. Happiness is a stable state of self-sufficiency and self-contentment. In other words, in every moment, what is and how it is enough. The measure of that sufficiency is subjective. Each person feels and defines it for themselves. When we say that happiness is a stable state of self-sufficiency and self-contentment, we are describing not an emotional surge or a fleeting pleasure, but a qualitative state of consciousness. Such a state does not depend on external circumstances because it rests not on objects, but on the inner wholeness of the subject. Let us unpack self-sufficiency and self-contentment layer by layer. Self-sufficiency is the ability to be whole without needing external validation, not to be confused with isolation or indifference. This is not about closing yourself off from the world, but about inner autonomy. I exist, and that is enough to be. Psychologically, this state correlates with a sense of inner grounding and the integration of the self-image that Erik Erikson wrote about. Neurophysiologically, self-sufficiency is linked to the harmonious functioning of the dopamine and serotonin systems. When the baseline level of satisfaction does not depend on constant external stimulation. Self-contentment is not complacency. It is the ability to experience a sense of agreement with yourself in the present moment. This does not mean that a person stops growing. They simply stop growing out of a sense of lack. Movement does not disappear. What disappears is the anxiety of needing to go faster, do more, be better. Abraham Maslow described this state through his concept of peak experience and self-actualization, when activity becomes an expression of inner fullness rather than a way to fill an inner void. Stability is the key word. Emotions rise and fall like waves, but a state grounded in self-sufficiency does not collapse under external storms. Modern affective neuroscience shows that a stable sense of well-being is connected not to positive emotions per se, but to the balance between the brain systems of arousal and inhibition, what Richard Davidson called emotional resilience. Such a person can feel sadness, anger, or pain while still not losing their inner center. One might say that happiness is a dynamic equilibrium between acceptance and creativity. You do not seek to escape life, yet you are not at its mercy either. Everything that happens becomes material for understanding rather than grounds for grievance. Buddhist psychology describes this state as upekkha, the Buddhist concept of equanimity, where the calm is not cold but warm, permeated with attentive presence. And here, a special form of freedom is born to be in the world but not imprisoned by it. Self-sufficiency and self-contentment transform life from a battlefield into a space of contemplation and creativity. This is not a final destination, but a way of being, steady, whole, and in inner harmony. Life's challenges. Every difficulty in life is not a punishment, but a creative challenge of the moment. A challenge arises where inner intentions meet external circumstances that cannot yet be overcome. Life, in essence, is the story of such challenges and our responses to them. You might pause and reflect on what challenges you have set for yourself and for life. The scale is different for everyone. Nearly everyone wants to become happy. Few have the intention to simply be, as strange as that may sound. The difference lies in the direction of effort. The person who wants to become happy directs their energy outward, towards substitute objects, relationships, possessions, achievements. The person who intends to be happy turns their attention inward, toward happiness as a state of consciousness. One seeks stimuli, the other seeks a resource. And here is an important point. Everything connected to the desire to become has no lasting prospect. Psychology calls this hedonic adaptation, a term introduced by Philip Brickman and Donald Campbell in 1971. We quickly adjust to any pleasant change, and our level of subjective well-being returns to its previous baseline. This is why external objects cannot provide lasting happiness. There is a saying, within every happiness, unhappiness is already contained. You dreamed of a good car, bought it. 6 months later, you are looking for a newer model. The old one no longer brings the same joy. Happiness is not an intellectual category, it is a lived state. Research by neuroscientists such as Richard Davidson at the University of Wisconsin, Madison shows that people who practice mindfulness and compassion exhibit stable activation of the frontal lobes, which are associated with positive emotional tone. This is not a cheerful mood, it is a stable inner equilibrium. But the creative challenge, if you will, is to discover within yourself the source of self-sufficiency and self-contentment. This requires an inner resource and, above all, intention. It cannot be artificially created. One can only ripen toward it. More on that shortly. Intention is an impulse of growth, not driven by fear or the thirst for gain. The next step is reflection, the ability to observe yourself from a distance and ask questions. For example, what is happiness? What is its nature? Under what conditions does it manifest? What inner resource sustains it? What does life feel like in a state of happiness, rather than in pursuit of it? Gradually, these reflections form into a coherent understanding. A natural desire arises to live this state, not merely to understand it. Practice, then, becomes not theory, but action. On this path, a person inevitably encounters the limits of the mind. When logic stops working, it is time for the tools of direct experience. Meditation is one of them, not as a trend, but as a method of self-regulation and self-observation. A 2010 study by Sarah Lazar at Harvard Medical School showed that after 8 weeks of mindfulness practice, participants showed increased gray matter density in areas responsible for attention and emotional regulation, the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus. This is biological evidence that inner states can be trained, that you can literally build a brain suited for stable happiness. In the course of practice, the skills of concentration, deconcentration, and introspection naturally develop. The ability to examine one's own state without judgment, and happiness gradually ceases to be a goal, becoming instead the background of existence. Of course, this is not an axiom. It is simply one possible route, the path of self-realization leading to the wholeness of a subject capable of being self-sufficient and self-content. Happiness cannot be sought. It must follow as a consequence, as a byproduct of one's own meaning. That was the central message of Viktor Frankl. If we approach the search for lasting happiness not as metaphysics, but as inner technology, it can quite readily be described in stages, with tools and feedback. This inner engineering rests not on promises, but on the patterns of neuropsychology, practical philosophy, and the experience of self-observation. Here is how the algorithm might look. First, diagnosing the state, recognizing scattered attention. The beginning of the path is not the search for happiness, but the acknowledgement that attention is scattered, the mind is reactive, and the inner dialogue is endless. This is not a mistake. It is the starting point. Without recognizing the chaos, it is impossible to move toward order. In neurophysiological terms, this is the work of the default mode network, active when a person's mind is wandering. The first step is to learn to notice when this is happening. Second, stabilizing attention, training concentration. Just as the muscles of the body are strengthened through exercise, attention is strengthened through holding focus. Practices of breath observation, concentration on bodily sensations, tracking sounds, and so on. All of this forms a neural habit. Attention is trainable. Research by Lazar and Davidson shows that even 10 to 15 minutes of focused practice per day changes the activity of the prefrontal cortex, the center of self-regulation. Third, engaging reflection, the shift from reaction to observation. It is important to learn to see your own thoughts, emotions, impulses, and reactions without merging with them. Reflection is not analysis, it is the recognition of patterns. When I think this way, I feel this. A simple algorithm. What am I thinking or feeling? Why am I thinking this? What purpose does this thinking serve? And how does it affect me and my life? Here, the anterior cingulate cortex becomes engaged, the region responsible for metacognition, the ability to think about one's own thinking. Fourth, expanding perception, deconcentration. Once attention becomes stable, one can move toward a diffuse, unfocused mode of perception, observing the whole field of experience without singling out objects. This is the opposite of concentration, yet it is built upon it. In this way, a holistic perception develops, one from which the familiar duality of observer and observed begins to dissolve. Fifth, meditation as synthesis, experiencing presence. Now practice becomes not a technique, but a state. Meditation not for the sake of peace, but for the sake of seeing that peace is the natural quality of awareness. In this state, the brain operates in a mode of coherence, synchronized activity across different regions. Neurophysiologically, this correlates with alpha and theta rhythms, which accompany a sense of deep well-being. Sixth, integration, returning to life, not to remain in meditation, but to carry the skill into daily life. Happiness is not maintained by effort. It is sustained by attentiveness to the moment, drinking tea, listening to someone speak, walking down the street, having a conversation. Everything becomes a continuation of the practice. This technology requires no faith, only observational honesty. It is worth starting small, 5 minutes of silence each day with no goal. Simply listen to what is happening inside. Even this sets the process in motion. Attention gradually finds its way back home. In short, the path to happiness is not a movement towards something. It is a return to what has always been there, but went unnoticed. Happiness is not a destination. It is the skill of presence. It requires inner maturity, and maturity requires practice. Without concentration, attention fractures into 1,000 small irritants. Without reflection, a person cannot distinguish what is happening inside them. Without meditation, they find no anchor in the stillness of consciousness. Concentration gathers energy, reflection directs it toward awareness, meditation returns it to the source. Together, they create a foundation, without which the search for happiness becomes an endless wandering between external pleasures and inner exhaustion. These are not the tools of mystics. They are the tools of a person who wants to live consciously. Those who practice mindfulness gradually cease to depend on circumstances, because their happiness is no longer a function of the external world. It becomes a state of presence, simple, deep, and quiet. If we are speaking of the intention to be happy, it begins not with the desire to change something, but with the resolve to see that everything is already here. It only remains to uncover it and to learn not to lose it again. In summary, the state of happiness can be reached by different routes because the human psyche itself is multi-layered. There is a biological level, a social level, a cognitive level, a spiritual level. Each layer offers its own algorithm for well-being. Viewed systemically, 3 fundamentally different paths can be identified, 3 models through which a person moves toward happiness. They might be called the exogenous, the endogenous, and the transcendent. The exogenous model, happiness through the external world, is the path of most people. Happiness is tied to achievement, possession, and recognition. I will be happy when is the classic formula of exogenous dependency. Biologically, this path operates through the dopamine reward system. Each achievement or acquisition produces a surge of dopamine, the hormone of motivation and pleasure. The problem is that dopamine adapts. The effect is short-lived. This forms what might be called the dopamine wheel, a constant race after new stimuli. Social psychology reinforces this model through a culture of comparison, success, status, attractiveness. The paradox is that excessive striving for happiness through external means often leads to growing anxiety and burnout. Nevertheless, the exogenous model is not false. It is natural to the phase of growth and the formation of personality. Through it, a person gains experience of desire, effort, and responsibility. It is, in a sense, the childhood of happiness. The endogenous model, happiness to inner regulation, is the path of the conscious subject. Here, happiness is understood as the result of inner equilibrium, not as a reward. The primary tool is attention and self-reflection. A person learns to observe their own states, understand their causes, and not identify with their emotions. Psychologically, this corresponds to the cognitive behavioral model, where thinking and perception govern emotion. Neurophysiologically, it is the training of the prefrontal cortex, which moderates the reactive impulses of the limbic system. Mindfulness practices, breath work, meditation, yoga, these are the tools of this path. Here, happiness becomes not a flash, but the background of conscious presence. This approach is the most stable, because what changes is not the object of attention, but the very quality of attention itself. The Transcendent model, happiness as going beyond the self, is a rare but the most profound route. It is based on the dissolution of the subject, on stepping beyond the boundaries of personal identity. Buddhism, Christian mysticism, Sufism, Advaita Vedanta all describe a moment when the distinction between happiness and unhappiness disappears. A shift in the center of perception occurs. There is no longer an observer evaluating experience. There is simply being. Contemporary research into altered states of consciousness, such as the work of Andrew Newberg, shows that in deep meditative states, activity in the parietal lobe, responsible for the sense of self and other, is significantly reduced. People describe this as a feeling of unity and unconditional peace. This is not an emotion, it is a fundamental experience of wholeness. These three paths do not compete, they evolve into one another. First, a person seeks happiness in the external world through experience. Then they turn attention inward through awareness. Finally, through deep inquiry, they come to recognize that the boundary between inner and outer is a construct. The exogenous model offers the experience of desire. The endogenous model offers the experience of mastering attention. The transcendent model offers the experience of unity. Simply put, the first path makes us wiser. The second makes us calmer. The third makes us freer. And the choice of route depends on where a person is right now. Not geographically, but in terms of the maturity of their perception. The evolution of desire into intention. This is the evolution of desire into intention, the gradual maturing of motivation as the external force of attraction transforms into inner awareness. Desire is an impulse directed outward. I need something I do not have. It is built on a sense of lack, on the gap between what is and what ought to be. Its driving force is deficiency. Biologically, this is the dopamine dynamic: arousal, anticipation, satisfaction, decline. And then the cycle begins again. Desire requires constant nourishment from objects. Intention is a different vector. It originates from within and does not rely on an object. It is not a reaction, but a state of directed being. If desire wants to receive, intention wants to realize. It does not seek compensation. It carries out the inner program of a ripened consciousness. Desire is fed by absence. Intention is fed by presence. This transformation does not happen through an act of will. It is natural, like the transition from adolescence into adulthood. When a person chases external objects of happiness and repeatedly encounters the rebound of hedonic adaptation, their attention gradually turns back toward the very source of desire. They begin to notice who is doing the wanting, where this striving arises from, and what within it is truly seeking peace. In this moment, the first spark of intention is born, not to achieve, but to understand. In philosophical terms, this is the transition from existence to essence, from living within forms to discovering what lies beneath them. In Eastern traditions, this is called the awakening of the energy of aspiration, bodhicitta in Buddhism, or the intention of the heart in Sufism. In Western psychology, analogs can be found in Maslow's concept of self-actualization and in Edward Dici's theory of intrinsic motivation. The evolution of desire into intention is, therefore, the inner transition that makes lasting happiness possible. Desire seeks happiness in the external. Intention discovers it as a state of being, and in that difference lies the full maturity of human consciousness.